Hello and welcome to the Storytelling with Pug podcast. We will, as always, start with a story.
On the 27th of April 2006, I ordered my husband. Not from a catalogue, not from a brochure, not even from the internet. I ordered my husband from the universe. I remember the date because it was my birthday. And I was reading an interview in the paper with Noel Edmonds, who had recently turned his life around, got a great TV deal of a lifetime, met his new wife, and was blissfully happy, all after learning the principles of something called cosmic ordering. So I did a bit of research. I ordered the book. I read it cover to cover, and I decided to give it a go. The book suggested to start by ordering something small from the universe. Check the universe is listening and work up to something bigger. But patience has never been one of my strongest attributes. So I didn't bother with the starting small nonsense. I decided if I was going to order something from the universe, I was going to go large. And so my first order was to meet the love of my life within the next 3 months. Now, the rules of cosmic ordering are actually quite simple and mainly involve being very clear and very specific about what you want. The universe doesn't like vague or wishy-washy. So I sat and wrote my quite detailed checklist, boxes that any potential suitor would have to tick if they wanted to be in the running. Highlights of my list include must be kind, loving, and caring. Must be trusting and trustworthy. Generous and supportive. Patient. Definitely needed to be patient. Must have own house and business and money, because I didn't want someone coming in and taking mine. Must get up early and must cook. So happy with my list, I put it to one side and waited for the universe to do its magic. 2 months later, I met Simon. I didn't know immediately if he ticked all the boxes, but over the course of the next few months, I realized he was very kind, very loving and caring, trusting, supportive, and very, very patient. And oh my God, does he get up early. He's a farmer. We live on a farm. And he gets up at some ridiculous hour of the morning, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. I will admit to having times when I've rather regretted asking for that one. However, nobody in the world is perfect. And actually, there was one box he didn't tick. He didn't cook. Well, not unless you count boiling pasta and chucking in a jar of pesto. But that was okay. It wasn't a deal breaker. And it certainly wasn't anything that a couple of good hairy biker cookbooks and a lot of encouragement couldn't rectify. And so on the 18th of June, 2009, 3 years later, and 13 years ago, I married the love of my life. And that is the story of how I ordered my husband from the universe.
Absolutely amazing. You said it wasn't a catalogue, but it's the universe's catalogue in some ways.
Yeah, I guess.
Susan, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. I'm going to ask you a lot more about it and find out all about how patient he really is and why, as we continue our conversation. But before I do that, and before I find out more about you, we're just going to have a quick introduction to the podcast.
You're listening to Storytelling with Puck, the podcast designed to show the power of stories in life and in business. Stories connect us on a deeper level, which is why we'll be sharing, chatting about, and feeling the impact they have on every one of us. Your host, Stefano, is the founder of Puck Creations, and we work with your business to define a clear, consistent, relevant brand which stands out from the crowd. We use that brand to create content that makes your audience think, feel, and take action. Visit puckcreations.com to find out more.
Before you do that, trust me, I can help you. Maybe that's not the best way to grab your attention or to get you to trust me. It's so noisy out there. I just don't know how to stand out. I've heard there's a way, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to tell you. Maybe I should let the author of The Business of Stories tell you instead. Susan Payton is her name, and luckily for you, she's with us today. Susan, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, well, lovely to be here. As you say, I am Susan Payton, and I recently launched my book, The Business of Stories, Harness the Power of Storytelling to Demonstrate Your Value, Attract Your Ideal Clients, and Get Paid What You're Worth. And what I do is basically help business owners, people who are really experts at what they do, passionate about what they do, coaches, consultants, people who, help other people, serve other people, make a huge difference. I help them use storytelling to create the connection that they want to create with the right people, with the people that they want to attract into their business through the power of storytelling, because storytelling is obviously something that we're all programmed to tune into. We all engage with storytelling. It's why we're all addicted to social media. It's why we watch a good film. We, love a great book. We love sitting around the dinner table with friends sharing stories. But quite often business owners struggle to know how to bring storytelling into their business and into their marketing. And that's what I help them do.
It's an incredible thing to do and couldn't be more aligned with this podcast than what we do. So
I know, totally.
And you started off, obviously every guest starts off storytelling with Puck by sharing a story, but it was quite clear from the beginning that stories are within you. There's something that you share all the time, and you have a knack of being able to tell a good story, a knack of being able to get your point across in a clear manner, but that's intriguing and gets people listening. Some people might say, that's because she's a good storyteller. That's natural. What would you say?
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. And it's why I wrestled a long time with, can I teach this? I have worked one-to-one with business owners for quite a few years now, because I felt like what I do with them one-to-one and when I'm, doing the work for them is very kind of intuitive. And, I know when I'm getting close to the story that we need to share because I get goosebumps, but I thought, can I teach that to somebody else? I don't know, it just felt very intuitive. I think to do it the way that I do it, you've got to be me. But I really wanted to move away from just working one-to-one. Every time I talked about storytelling in groups or in, to people, I saw how many people wanted to get better at this. And I saw how many people, saw how important it was, and but didn't necessarily have the budget or were in a position to work with me one-to-one. And, I wanted to get to more people. I wanted to work one-to-many. I wanted to do workshops. I wanted to do group programs. But first I had to see if I could teach what I do. So I started to unpack the process. I started to, document what I was doing. And there was a point as that evolved that I thought, yes, I can teach this. There is a framework here. There's a process. It's my framework. It's my process. But actually, without realizing it, this is what I do. There is an order. There is actually a process here. And as I started to document that, I thought, this is a book. actually. I could write a book about this. Then I signed up to a program to help me get that book out of my head in a way that was very structured. And even though I write for a living, but writing a book is actually quite different. And during the process of writing the book, my process evolved and my framework evolved. And actually, I started to go, down a layer and thinking, actually, yeah, we've unpacked the stories, but then what about the stuff that comes out of the stories? And so, yes, in answer to the question, I do appreciate that some people are better storytellers. I do think that, I don't think you're born a storyteller, but I've always loved stories. I loved English at school. I loved reading stories to my kids, even when they didn't want me to anymore. I was like, please. Everything I've done, when I look back, I realize has got an element of storytelling to it. So years ago, I used to work for Capital Radio. I used to work for Chris Tarrant, and I used to find his little stories, that he would read out, kind of strange stories from around the world. I worked in PR for a while. I used to write press releases. I worked in events, and events are inviting people into a story, right? So when I look back, I realized that actually storytelling is a theme in everything that I've been doing. And even when I meet, friends for dinner, they always say, oh, God, you always have the best stories. Like, how comes you've got such good stories? But I think I look for them. I find them. I'm not telling stories that anybody else couldn't tell. When I told my story to my community way back in 2015, before I was the Business of Stories, it was no humdinger of a story. It wasn't some Hollywood blockbuster story. It was the story of ups and downs and challenges. And at the time, I was a single mum and, I had ME. And I just talked about what those challenges looked like, what got me through the tough times, and people resonated with that because it was a story that many people related to in some way. So I don't think you have to be a master storyteller. I don't think you have to be, J.K. Rowling. I think you just have to go through the process of unpacking the stories that are important. And I talk in the book about there's 3 stories, the key 3 stories, which are your personal story, your business story, and your customer story. Then we explore those stories a bit more, looking for your why and your value and your people that, you really, really feel called to serve. And then we look at, okay, now how do we pull out the stories that are really relevant? I actually take people to the sweet spot in the middle of the process where, we can pull out the stories that are relevant. We know who we're talking to. We know what stories to tell. We know how to tell them, when to tell them. And then we start to craft them and then we start to share them. So I believe anyone can learn how to be a storyteller. And there's lots and lots of tips in the book on how to do everything from how to start a story, how to choose a story, how to craft a story, how to finish a story. So I do think anybody can get better at it, definitely.
I completely agree with you. I definitely think people can get better at it. And your book guiding them through that, I think, is really helpful. I think often the first barrier to people sharing stories is fear. They don't believe they have it within them to share stories. As you say, people will tell you, oh, you always have a story every time. I don't understand how you do it. I could never do that. And that I could never repeat the process over and over again. And part of the reason I think it comes down to something you mentioned in the middle of your brilliant answer is that your story, in your mind, the one that you shared before you got into this process in 2015, which I might touch on a bit more in a second if you'd be okay with me doing that.
Yeah.
But that particular story that you shared, to your mind, wasn't a big Hollywood blockbuster. It wasn't this massive story, but you shared it anyway. You were happy to share it because you had developed an intuition to understand some of the power of storytelling. And even if you didn't logically know that at the time as you do now, you felt it was still a story that people might want to listen to. I think what often happens, and you can tell me if you agree with me here, and what possibly happens to a lot of people is they think, well, I don't have a story to tell. I don't have anything interesting to say. What do I do every day? I get up, I go to work, I come back, I feed the kids, I feed myself, I go to sleep. Obviously, that is not what most people do with the day, even if they think they do. There's often billion things going on. So I guess a couple of questions off the back of that. How do you get people to realize that they do have a story? I'm not going to say does everyone have a story, because I think we both know the answer to that is yes. How do you get them to realize that? And how do you instill enough confidence in them through your one-to-one sessions and also through the book to then want to share their stories?
So there's a few things there that you touched on. First of all, and I do say this in the book, that most people do not have a rags to riches story. They've never been homeless. They've never been penniless. They've never been, near-death experience. They've never been abducted by aliens.
I have.
So
I just want to say I haven't told that story yet, but I'll give it a few. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Keep going.
Yeah. Apart from you, most people have not. That's not their story. So actually, they're not the stories they can really relate to, because that's not their story. The stories they can relate to are the stories of the ups and downs, the everyday things, the fears, like you mentioned, the things that are holding us back, the challenge that we're facing, what got us through it, how we dealt with it, what we learned as we were going through it, how we came out the other side, what changed, who we became, what the transformation was, all of those things. And actually, they are everyday stories. And yes, like you said, everybody's story is unique and fascinating. I have never, ever come across somebody whose story I didn't find fascinating. It's unique. Nobody's lived your life. Nobody's had your experiences, And here's the thing. It is the one thing that no one else can copy. Okay. People can copy everything that you do. I've had it happen. I've literally had a whole workshop, stolen. People can copy your marketing. People can copy, just about everything. But no one can copy your story. That's yours. That is completely unique. So that's the first point. The second point is, when I told my story back in 2015, I felt very vulnerable. I was opening up to a group of about 1,500 women in business who didn't really know who I was. And I didn't know how they would take it. I didn't know if I would be judged. I didn't know what people would make of it, what they would think of me. Would they all up and leave the group? Because there was a lot of challenges. I'd also lost a lot of money in the property market crash. There was things in my story that were, mistakes I'd made. And so I did panic a little bit when I sent the story. I actually wrote the story out. And this was before the days of Facebook Lives and all of those things, So I'm a writer anyway. I'm happiest when I'm writing. So I wrote my story out, almost like a blog post. I put some pictures in there, and I sent it out to this group. And I literally sat there and panicked, and I thought, oh my God, what have I just done? And a few minutes later, I got an email back from somebody saying, I've just read your story and it completely resonates with me. And she told me a little bit about her story and the similarities that and she said, I totally get where you're coming from. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for being so honest and open. And then by the time I'd finished reading that email, another one had come through, and then another one. And honestly, it went on for days. People coming back to me and messaging me and saying, you know, how much they related to my story. And the really interesting thing is people started asking me, so how do we work with you? And what is it that you do? And can we jump on a call? And like, could you help me tell my story? And suddenly, you know, I got more clients in the following month than I'd probably done in the previous 12. And all I'd done is tell my story. But, you know, I wasn't a faceless moderator of a group anymore. I was a real human being who had, you know, been very vulnerable, very honest, very open, and shared my story, which, like I say, was not, you know, they're never going to make a film of it. It's really not that exciting, but people could relate to it. And what people actually relate to are the feelings, the emotions. Yeah. When I talked about feeling lost, when I talked about feeling helpless, when I talked about thinking that everybody else had it sussed and I didn't, you know, all of those feelings, that's what people can relate to. And they are the stories that people will connect with. And we like to be around people that we connect with, that we feel a connection with. And that's obviously what storytelling does. And yeah, you know, when we look at the three stories, there's your personal story, then there's your business story. You know, businesses and brands don't just pop up from nowhere. There's a story, there's a journey, there's, you know, there's millions of stories there to tell. And then there's your customer story, like what's going on for them? Where are they at? Where are they trying to get to? Where are they on their journey? And where do you fit into that story? So I can't remember the question. But
so there were two questions which you have covered in your answer.
Yes.
And
getting your head around sharing the story. Yes,
yeah, exactly.
Realizing
that you do have a story and getting around the fear of actually being able to share that story. And what you've done really well actually is given an example of how it works by sharing your story. And I think that's what. Sorry, that sounded really patronising. What you've done really well, but I think that's what.
Demonstrated.
Yeah, exactly. But I think actually that's what stories do as well. Is they demonstrate your understanding, your knowledge, There's a podcast I've been listening to recently. It's a BBC history podcast called "You're Dead to Me," which is made by one of the creators of the Horrible Histories series for kids. But it's a history podcast for adults, and it's all about. Well, it's aimed at people who maybe didn't love history at school or didn't like the way it was being taught, but actually now they've gotten a bit older, are kind of interested and want to find out things again, you know, see things in the news and go, but why did that start?
Yeah.
Something I've noticed about it, which is brilliant, they always have two guests. They have a historian who is sharing the story and describing what's happened. And they have a comedian on there whose main role is to make fun of everything, which is just brilliant in itself. But by the end, they always do a bit of a test for the comedians to say, well, what have you learned during this? Not once throughout the podcast do they list out facts. Not once do they say, on this date, blah, blah, blah happened. And this is the bit we're going to test you on, or anything like that. They just share a story. They have a chat and they have a bit of a laugh. Almost always, by the end, the comedian, when they do 10 questions, gets 9 or 10 out of the 10 questions right. And the reason is there's often an argument about, well, should you have facts or should you have stories in your marketing? You have both, but you share the facts through a story. And I think that's what you've just demonstrated really well then, is that facts are important, and sharing your business and how your business works and your brand, as you say, it doesn't come from nowhere. But to share it well so that people are going to remember it, they have to feel something. And it's all about that feeling. So
totally.
We're
emotional beings.
Exactly, we're emotional beings, and what that's leading me to now, and if you don't mind, and you don't have to do this because I haven't asked you about this before, but you've mentioned your story throughout the podcast so far and kind of touched on some of the challenges. Would you mind sharing some of that story with us? I know you don't have the written version and the version you gave in 2015, but maybe letting our listeners know a bit more about you and who you are and where all this did come from.
Sure. And I'll actually take you on from that point where I told my story, because the response that I got from telling my story was phenomenal and made me realize a few things. It made me realize the power of story. It made me realize that story is a co-creation. It's not a one-way thing. You know, even when I'm telling my story, people are relating it to theirs. So my story is really only half of the story. There's also, you know, there's how that story is landing with you and what it's making you think about and feel. And I tell a couple of stories in the book about examples where that's happened to me, where someone's been telling me their story and I've related it to mine. But it's because of that I started to say to people, and at the time I was doing really more general business coaching. You know, I'd always worked for myself, and my group was called the Business of Mums, and it was very much for mums who were starting their own business. So I was offering quite general coaching, but I kept saying in the group, guys, you've got to tell your story. Like, it's really powerful. You know, look what happened when I told mine, you know. Or I'd get on a call with somebody and they'd be telling me the challenges in their business. And I would find myself saying, well, take me back. Like, what's your story? A bit like you just did to me, you know, tell me how this all began and tell me about the journey you've been on. And then they would tell me a fascinating story because, like I said, they always are. And they would tell me their journey and what led them here today. And so much would jump out of that story, like, you know, their why, their values. They didn't have to tell me them. They showed me what they were by telling me their story. They jumped out of the story. And so more and more, I was talking a lot about the topic of storytelling, which was already something, like I say, I was passionate about. I just hadn't yet, even at that point, I still hadn't thought of it as a thing all on its own. Then I went to the university. I live in Chichester. I went to the University of Chichester, not as a student, as they do like a thing for business owners. Like, I think they call it a business incubation center or something. And I went to one of the talks there. And I'd been a few times, so I knew the guy that kind of ran it and found speakers and organised workshops and things. And we were chatting, and he said to me, I would love to run a workshop for business owners on storytelling. And I said, that sounds amazing. Like, let me know when it is, because I'd love to come. And he looked at me and he said, I was kind of hoping that you'd be at the front of the room delivering it.
Brilliant.
And it was one of those moments where I thought, oh my goodness, like, this is a thing, you know, like, I'm talking about it already to people, but I could just talk about that. I could forget all the other stuff that I'd been coaching people with, because actually, if you get the story piece right, and I'm not just talking about one story, that is a point I want to make. It's because sometimes people hear about storytelling and they think, oh, it's my story and it's on my about page. Job done, you know, I'm good. It's not that. There are stories everywhere, and there are tons of stories to tell. And actually, everybody who goes through my book just says, okay, now I need to know where to file all these stories, and like, how do I categorize them, and how do I keep track of them? Because we've all got millions of stories. But I digress. So I had one of those aha light bulb moments where I thought, actually, this is a thing all on its own, because actually it makes everything else easy. When you get the storytelling piece right, It makes your marketing easy. It makes sales conversations easy. It makes finding the right people that you want to work with easy. Because people are already connect with you, before they even have a call with you. So I literally got in the car that night and I was driving home, and I remember being aware that I was smiling from ear to ear. Like, I just had the biggest smile on my face. And I got back and I walked in the door. My husband looked at me and he said, what are you doing? And I said, I think I found my thing. Like, I found it. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, I'm just going to talk about storytelling. I'm not going to do any of the other stuff that I do. I'm been trying to be all things to all people, which a lot of us do, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm just going to talk about storytelling. I'm just going to help people tell their story. And he said, okay, sounds good. And then the universe, as you know, I'm a big fan of the universe. The universe stepped in and everything just fell into place. When you put something out there and then suddenly you just get, the guy just asked me to run a workshop. I was going to something the following week and I was speaking to the guy that was organizing that. And he said, oh, do you want to come and do a few minutes at the front of the stage about that? And then somebody else said to me, I want to test something out on somebody's website. Do you want me to do your one-page website? Everything just happened literally within days. I was like, my God, I've got a business here. I changed the name of the business of mums to the business of stories. And off I went as the storyteller. And I have never looked back. It's been the most incredible adventure. It's taken me out to Nashville, USA, to train with a company called Storybrand. I don't know if you've come across Storybrand. I have... in fact, this October, I'm going to speak in Barcelona at a conference about storytelling. I've worked with amazing clients. I've worked with charities. I've worked one-to-one. Now I'm actually taking 16 people through my first group program, which is brilliant. I got to write a book that got to #1 and #2 in the UK. And the USA. So it's all been an absolute ball. I've loved every minute of it. And it all started with me pressing that button, even though I felt vulnerable and even though I didn't know how people were going to take it. I pressed the button and I told my story. And if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here now doing this.
And from that, you now have another story to tell. As you said at the beginning of your answer to this question, I know I was asking you about your original story, and I think you did something beautiful. You said, actually, I'm going to take you beyond that, because that was my story I told then. And obviously it's still important. It still resonates. It still sits. It's part of the underlying factor that got you to where you are now. But since then, the story's evolved.
Yeah.
And it's now almost a sequel. It's Top Gun Maverick. You need to share part 2 with the world. And if people want to hear part 1, they can go back and hear it. But part 2 is where you're at. But actually, a big part of your answer, and other than the amazing facts about your book, which we are going to talk about more in a second, because they are incredible stats. But other than that, you mentioned it's not about one story. It's not about having your about page done, getting somebody to write your about page for you, saying, well, this is me. I was born in 1975. I'm not talking about you, by the way. This is nobody's actual birth date, or me. I was born in 1975. I have 2 cats, and I really love cats because, who doesn't love cats? And that's your great about story, and that's all you've got. It's about actually having a better about story than that, but realizing that stories are everywhere. A good friend of ours, a friend of the show as well, Andrew Thorpe, who's also a brilliant storyteller, talks about having a library of stories. Now, that might seem daunting to people, but I think you were touching on the same idea in your answer a second ago. And I do think that you mentioned, I think in your first answer, that you see stories everywhere. You go into a room and you see something happening, and you don't just go, oh, that was interesting, and then forget about it. You make a mental note of it, and sometimes possibly a physical note. I'm not sure. How can somebody who doesn't necessarily think that way at the moment start to create a library of stories?
Well, one of the things that I do to get people to get started is to think about a moment in your journey, okay? A defining moment.
What a brilliant idea. Think about a moment. Susan will shortly give you a more detailed guide about how to get to that moment. We've already heard about a few of the big moments in her life that she's turned into powerful stories that resonate. She's also convinced you that everyone has a story and explained why you don't have to be a natural storyteller to connect with people on a deeper level. Keep listening to find out how to create a bank of stories, to see when you can use your stories in business, and to discover the importance of cleaning your windows. Before all of that, here's a man with a full library of stories to tell you a little more about his storytelling podcast. Andrew Ford, over to you.
We're all in the persuasion business, whether that's pitching to a potential client, selling ourselves in a job interview, or convincing a teenager to tidy their room. How we frame our message and how we deliver it makes all the difference, and this is the theme of my podcast, Leaning Forward. I'm Andrew Thorpe. I'm a speaker, a trainer, and a storyteller, and I'd love you to tune in to our latest episode.
It might be a moment where, somebody said something or something happened, or, people talk about that straw that broke the camel's back, or something triggered you, something made you angry, or you had to, something where you had to step up, or you had to change, or you had to walk away from something. We have all got tons and tons of these moments, okay? I talk about the moment I pushed the button and I sent my story out there. I talk about the moment the guy at the university said to me, I was hoping you'd be at the front of the room. I talk about, there's another story I tell where I start with, I was sat at the kitchen table crying into my very large glass of wine, saying to my husband, I've got a great group, but I haven't got a business. Right? These stories are moments in time, okay? But you can pick one of those moments and tell that story. And I always tell people to start it in the moment, okay? Because what people do, and I do this on I run a free masterclass, and I say to people, think of a defining moment, and then I pick somebody to share the defining moment. And this is what they'll do. They'll go, well, I was working in a thing, and then this happened, and then I was feeling more and more unhappy, and then this happened, and then it got to the point, and then I made a change, and then I walked away, and then I started my business, and then and they tell me this whole story, and I go, so tell me the moment, like the moment that you think, and sometimes again, they still struggle to get it down to the moment. And then finally we hear about the moment when they were sat on the train at 7:30 a.m. and they'd left their little one with the childminder crying. And they were sat there in this train, packed, hot, feeling sad. And suddenly they decided that they weren't going to do this anymore. And I say to them, start your story there. Mm-hmm. Okay? Start the story there. Where does a James Bond film start? Right in the middle of the action. Okay? He's going to be running across the rooftops. They don't start by filling in all the background, telling us what they're going to tell us. They start in the middle of the action. So that is a way for people to start thinking about stories, is think about some moments, okay? Then as far as, you know, I agree, I talk about building a bank of stories, you know, and having them there, because sometimes I will think of a story. I did it yesterday. I thought of a story, I jotted it down, but I wasn't sure how to use it. I didn't particularly have anything to tie it to. So I've just put it into my little filing system, and what will happen is I'll be writing an email in a few weeks, or I'll be writing about launching my course, and I'll suddenly think, that story is perfect. And I'll go and I'll get it out. So I use Trello. Lots of people, I'm not particularly techie, and I like Trello because it's just there. It's like, you know, cards, I can see them. I'm very visual. So I like Trello. Lots of people in my group coaching program at the moment have been telling me about all sorts of other apps that they found that are amazing, which is great. So I don't think it really matters where or how. I think find something that suits you, but I think just get into the habit of capturing them and recording them somewhere, even if it's in a Google Doc, you know, just somewhere, or it's notes on your phone if you're out. Or the other thing I do is talk into my phone. So I take my dog for a walk every day after lunch, and I talk into my phone the whole way round, unless sometimes I'm listening. Sometimes I listen to something. A lot of the time I'm just talking. And it could be one of my stories. It could be a story I'm helping a client with. But I will just talk and talk and talk, and I'll record it, and then I'll get back, and then I'll play it back, and then I'll pull out the bits. But actually, I find if I walk and talk, especially outdoors in the fresh air, it really, creative juices start flowing. You're not sitting there with your fingers on the keyboard waiting for some, you know, amazing, well-crafted story to just appear on the screen. If you just start by talking into your phone. So yeah, you know, just find the ways that you like to get the stories out, find them, capture them, record them, and then you can start thinking about how can I start using these in my communications, when I talk to people, in my marketing, in social media.
That's brilliant. It's such a good explanation. The moment in time part that you had made my heart flutter a little bit, because it's something we talk about all the time. Capturing a moment in time, think back to a moment in time. This podcast, actually, Storytelling with Puck, the podcast, didn't start as a podcast. It started as an initiative, which we still have every year in February, the beginning of February, where our aim is to get as many people as possible on social media to share stories. It's as simple as that. They can be about anything. They don't have to be about business, etc. And something we advise is exactly what you just said then. Think about a moment in time. That's all you have to do. Think about a moment in time. And then as you're building your story and you want to tell it, you can think about what happened before and what happened after, and you have a story. So for people who think they don't have a story, you do. It's right there. Yeah. So I love the way you explained that. And I think it will resonate with a lot of people who maybe are still unsure of whether or not they have something to tell. But what also I think you've captured in terms of having the bank and or the library, or however you want to put it, and writing it down and making notes, is then people will go, yeah, but what if I don't know the right time to use them? What if I don't know how to communicate with them? Yeah, I have this bank of stories, but I can't just tell a story in a networking meeting, because I mean, how am I supposed to tell a story in a networking meeting? What if, you know, they're talking about something else, and they're talking about how successful their business is? I can't just start sharing a story. How do I do that? Or how do I know which one to share? I have my ideas on this, but this podcast is about your ideas, not mine. So what advice would you give?
I do talk about the importance of being strategic about your storytelling. You know, storytelling's not dumping. It's not telling stories for the sake of it. It shouldn't be random, you know. You do need to put a little bit of thought into it. You need to be intentional. You need to know exactly who you're telling your stories to, you know, who you're trying to attract into your business. And you need to know where they are on their journey and where you fit into their story. So I talk a lot about this in the book. But the reason that I have the process that I have with this sweet spot in the middle is that when you've unpacked the stories and you've worked through them, you do get to this place where you do know what stories to tell, because you'll know the stories that are going to resonate with I call them your people. When we start the journey with saying ideal clients, target market, but when we get to chapter, I don't know, I think it's 6 or 7, I start calling them your people, because you really want to tune in to who are the people that you really want to work with. You can make the biggest difference to, where you can have the biggest impact. That you really feel passionate about working with. And when you understand who they are and you understand what their challenge is and what's holding them back, and you understand their fears and you understand where they're trying to get to, you understand what they want to achieve and who they want to be, and you know how to get them there. When you can help them with the challenge that they've got, and you can be that guide for them, that Yoda, for them, and help guide them to that happy ever after, to that place where they want to get to, you'll know what stories to tell. And actually part of the process as you go through the book is to start going back and choosing from the stories that we've unpacked in previous chapters. We actually go back and start looking for the stories that are going to really connect with the person that you want to speak to. So somebody might say, oh yeah, but if I'm at a networking event, I'm talking to all sorts of people from all sorts of businesses. That's fine. You talk to your people. You tell the stories that will resonate with your people, and other people will understand who those stories are for. Stories are universal anyway, right? Storytelling is a universal language that we all understand, we all engage with. Somebody getting up and telling their own story will connect with people. But when we are strategic about it, and we, as part of that process, we are very clear about who we work with and what we help them do, then we make it very easy for people in that networking meeting to tell other people, right? That's how you get known for what you do. Stories are easy to pass on. That's what storytelling is about, right? Sharing it with others, passing it down. When we tell a story, it's really easy for people to remember that story and tell it on. I remember talking at networking meetings. I remember going to a networking meeting, and, we were all going round and doing the 60 seconds. And if you've ever been to a networking meeting, you will know that some people probably say the same thing every time, and it's around what they do and what it looks like. And,
Hi, my name's John. I have a tech company, and we got 5 figures last week, just in a week, because we sell the best stuff to the best customers. I don't know why I'm American, but also I'm not even sure if I was American. I'm not sure what accent that was, but yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah, or they say things like, I'm an accountant, it's very boring, and they'll kind of almost belittle themselves a little bit because they think that that's what we're all thinking. So you hear this a lot at networking meetings. And then you go around the table, and then I was at this networking meeting, and we came to a guy, and the guy stood up, because everybody stands up when they do the thing. And he said, I'm a window cleaner. Okay. And he said, now, let me ask you a question. When somebody comes to your building for the very first time, and you want to make a good impression, when do you make that first impression? Is it when they get to the reception desk and they're talking to the receptionist? Is that the first impression that they have of your business? And most people will go, yeah, I guess so. And he said, wrong. The first impression is when they're walking into that building. imagine if you've got dirty windows. Like, what is that saying about you and your business? You know, you need to, your first impression starts before they've even entered the front door. And if you haven't got clean windows, you need to come and see me. I just thought that was brilliant. Absolutely. Who's going to forget that? No, I've never forgotten that. And that was years ago. I've used it in examples. I might have even used it in the book. I can't remember now. I thought it was brilliant. You know, how to talk about window cleaning with a story. That everybody in that room was like, oh my God, you're right. You know, you're right. We need a window cleaner. So, yes, you definitely, you can use storytelling in anything, no matter who you're talking to. You just need to have given it some thought about why you're telling the story and who you're telling it to and what you want them to do.
It's a wonderful way of putting it. And I think there's a few things that stood out to me then. Obviously, the window cleaning story. I started looking at my windows as soon as you said that.
Well, luckily, no one comes to my house, so I'm all right. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same, actually. That's okay. Again, you're right. It was a good story to start off with, but what makes it more powerful is that people then want to retell it. And some people won't retell it because for some people it won't have resonated in the same way as you. But something you said at the very beginning of your answer was it doesn't matter because you're talking about your people. The people in the room who it's not resonating with in the same way also won't hate it. They'll just go, okay, and then move on to the next one. And that's fine. But the people who it does resonate with are suddenly an advert for your business because they're going to say a week later, do you know, I was just looking at my windows in the office today and they really need a clean. And I just need to tell you the story because last week,
you'd want that guy, wouldn't
this
you?
guy that I met in a networking meeting.
Yeah,
you'd want that guy. You'd want him. You'd hope he also does a good job at cleaning windows and not just stories. But yeah. So again, that's the power of a good story. Now, also throughout your answer, you were mentioning the idea of if you have the bank and if you know who you're talking to and you know who your audience is, you'll then be able to tell the story at the right time. And I do agree with that. I will say something that I think does happen is there will also be occasions where you tell the story at not quite the right time and it doesn't fit and it doesn't match. But that's also okay. Yeah. People don't usually mind that much. You're not really doing anything particularly wrong. People might go, okay, that wasn't really relevant to me. But because people like stories anyway, I think you said it at the earlier on, you mentioned the idea that if you just go up and tell your story on stage, even if your audience isn't in that environment, most people will go, oh, nice story. But if it's relevant, then they'll want to buy something for you, or they'll want from you, or they'll want to connect with you and build a relationship with you or collaborate with you or whatever it is. And I think I'm kind of reiterating what you said, but that's where stories have a powerful impact.
And you're right. You know, they don't always. I tell stories on LinkedIn sometimes, and I think, and I will do a post, and I'll think, oh, this is good. This is gonna really get a ton of engagement, and I get crickets. You know, and then the next week I'll put something out, but you know, just kind of did it as I thought of it, and put it out, and I get 4,000 views and 37 comments. And that's okay too, because the other thing to remember is, and I often get people message me on LinkedIn, direct message, can we have a chat? Really interested in what you're doing. Think you might be able to help us. And maybe they've never liked one of my stories, maybe they've never engaged with it or commented on it, but they've read it, So it's not all about how many likes or comments you get. There's somebody on the group coaching program at the moment who's been really active on LinkedIn since she started the program, and she's been telling lots of stories, something that she never did before. She's got quite a corporate background, so she hadn't really ever embraced storytelling. She read the book, decided to come on the program, and she started using storytelling a lot more on LinkedIn. And people are really loving it and really engaging with it and commenting and saying, I really love the stories that you started telling and sharing. she even sent me a message yesterday saying, oh, I've just posted something on LinkedIn. Can you just go and have a read and see if, because we all doubt ourselves, you know, and we put a story out there and we think, oh, I don't know, is that okay? And she said, can you go and have a quick look? And I was on a call. It was probably half an hour before I could go and have a look. And when I went and had a look, it already had something like 16 comments on it because people had just engaged with it. And she said, you know, people are asking about her program that she's putting together, because I also always encourage people to put a call to action at the end of a story, you know, and that's another thing that people shy away from is, I can't go from story to selling. That would be awful, you know. So I teach people how to do that in a way that doesn't feel salesy and it doesn't feel awkward. And actually it's completely natural. Like it would almost be odd if we didn't. So she's been doing lots of that. And so, yes, it's not always about putting stories out, and it's not always about the reaction that you get immediately. You know, even in a room, sometimes you can be talking, you can tell a story, you can look around and think, oh, I'm not sure if that landed the way I hoped it would. But then people come up to you afterwards or message you afterwards and say, you know, that story that you told is just still in my mind, you know. It really resonated with me. So, but you never really know until you start putting them out there, you know, and you'll get better. Like you said earlier, stories evolve and grow with you. Your business is changing and your stories will change. Your offer might change. Your process might change. Your thinking around some stuff might change. You might niche. You might you know, suddenly decide you want to focus on a particular area or a particular audience. And so you might tell different stories, or you might tell the same story in a different way.
Yes.
That's fine too. You just need to go out there and start telling them so that you can see what lands, what works, what response you get, and, you know, just get your stories working for you.
Talking of call to actions, you called on the universe. We know that. And it worked really well. You have Simon, and and Simon gets up early to farm. Simon is patient. Simon now cooks, even though he didn't.
He can cook. I wouldn't say he does cook, but he can. Yeah.
That bit's still grated, isn't it? I can feel it. But
he gets home too late, to be honest. We've normally eaten by the time he gets home, so.
That's fair. That's fair. I'm going to forgive Simon, and it's up to you if you want to forgive.
Okay.
But so you had your call to action in that sense. But what I now want to do is give our listeners another call to action, and that call to action, well, let's give them more than one. That's maybe not the best advice usually, but let's give them more than one today. So I want them to go and buy your book, because they're going to help it stay above Stephen Bartlett, and that's really important. You can tell us a little bit more about that in a second. And then I want them also to discover you on other platforms and to find out where they can speak to you and work out how they can tell more stories and gather their libraries and explain things in a way that actually captures people's attention. But I can't do any of that. You have to tell people where to find you. So where can you be found?
Nice segue there, by the way. I like the way you put that. Yes, my book is available on Amazon and on most major online bookstores. The Business of Stories by Susan Payton. But I'm also going to let you into a secret. If you go to my website, thebusinessofstories.com/free book, and you have to know that because you wouldn't find it on the website. But if you know to go to /free book, you can, if you want to, download a PDF version of the book for free. Otherwise, yes, you can get it on Amazon. My website is obviously thebusinessofstories.com, and on LinkedIn, I am Susan Payton UK.
Amazing. We will add all of that to the show notes, of course. If you can buy the book, because it's well worth the money. So go out there and buy it. You've heard Susan today. You've heard her explain stories. You must now understand how much of an expert she is in what she does, and she's going to make you an expert. But of course, if you can't afford it right now, that's why she's given that wonderful offer of being able to download the PDF for free. Susan, I can't tell you how delighted I am to have you with us for the podcast today. Thank you so much for sharing, and also just for helping people understand the power of stories, which is what we're all about too. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a lot of fun.
We will, as always, finish with a story.
Seldom do you see tales roaming free. Obscure they are in style, renowned for their guile. Yield. Time is not passing. Elves, they are chanting. Leprechauns are demanding. Lions don't exist. Innocuous their seeming, never to be dreaming. Gore returns, we're screaming, writing words that can't be missed. Inhale, slowly. It's time to take a break. Thoughtless rhymes are no match for the crimes Hercule has on his plate. Perhaps it's not lost. Ugliness cured by kindness, praise one another. Extracting creations hurts like no other. This is not poetry. It's a story with rhythm. You and your magic make great stories happen.
You've just been listening to an episode of the Storytelling with Puck podcast. Your support keeps our podcast going, so please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Subscribe to keep up to date with the latest episodes, and never forget the importance of sharing your stories.